Welcome to the Link Online. Well, hello once again, and welcome to the program. And if you're watching us live on Facebook or on our own RCI Net website, you will see today my colleague Lynn Desjardins, who joins me.
Hello, everyone. I'm back.
And there we are. Look at that. So quickly. We had that tour right across Canada, and here we are in studio once again. I'm Mark Montgomery, and speaking of studio, we have in the control room our regular Benoit Durand, who's controlling things, along with today we have Pierre-Luc Blais, and, of course, the man of mystery, Pierre Dutil, who hides behind the glass. We know he's doing important things, we just can't see him. But just rest assured, he's doing very important work. We have a lot of interesting stuff coming up for you on the show as usual, but I would like to say hello to Radio Cowrie, 97.5 FM in Nigeria. Of course, World Radio Paris as well, and the shortwave service from Germany.
Bonjour, tschüss.
Bonjour, no, tschüss is goodbye.
Oh.
Guten Tag.
Guten Tag.
There we
Wie
go.
gehen Sie?
All right.
We should tell them what's coming up on the show.
Well, let's have you start.
You could probably do it in German, actually. Mark worked in Germany for quite some time. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah.
Okay, so coming up, I'll tell you about a creative way that one group found to get more people, especially young people, to vote in this upcoming federal election in Canada.
And speaking of votes, the Canadian federal election is at approximately the halfway point before we actually get to the polls. And the leaders of the political parties are making all kinds of announcements and promises. And Lavon, who is not here today, but he left us a story about Conservative leader Andrew Scheer's announcement that he would reduce the foreign aid budget and use the money instead to help Canadians. And also, the National Hockey League begins its regular season.
Yay!
But one commentator says the fighting has to stop because there is a tragic human cost later in life. That's coming up on this edition of The Link Online. All right, we're going to start out in politics, and as mentioned, Lavon left us this story about the Conservative leader, Andrew Scheer, who said he would reduce Canada's foreign aid spending by a quarter and instead use those savings to help Canadians. And that was just one of the main points Conservative leader Scheer made earlier this week when he unveiled his foreign policy.
He also said a Conservative government would reinvigorate Canada's traditional alliances with the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand.
And Scheer said if elected, Conservatives would focus Canada's foreign aid on countries with the greatest need. Much of Canada's aid would go to sub-Saharan Africa, he said.
Canadians are generous, and we want to help those around us in need. The vast majority of Canada's foreign aid is well spent on humanitarian assistance to countries mired in structural poverty or facing a humanitarian crisis. But under Justin Trudeau, a significant chunk of Canadian foreign aid money does not fit that description. The Trudeau government today sends $2.2 billion of so-called foreign aid to middle and upper income countries like Argentina, Barbados, Brazil, China, Iran, Italy, Mexico, and Turkey. Worse still, some of that money is shoveled to repressive regimes that are adversarial, if not outright hostile to Canadian interests and values. Countries like Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Trudeau has also spent $110 million on the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is openly anti-Semitic and continues to support terrorist organizations like Hamas. At a time when Canadians are working harder than ever and not getting ahead, Trudeau is using their hard-earned tax dollars to support anti-Semitic organizations and prop up foreign dictatorships. It's time for Canada to put our money where our mouth is and only use foreign aid to support the Canadian values we hold dear. A new Conservative government will review Canada's overall foreign aid funding with a target of reducing the overall envelope by approximately 25%. We will cut 25% in foreign aid currently going to corrupt regimes and middle and higher income countries. It will start by taking the money that Justin Trudeau is currently squandering overseas and spending it at home to provide much needed and long overdue help to Canadian families so they can get ahead.
And that was an excerpt of Conservative leader Andrew Scheer's foreign policy announcement earlier this week. He could be Canada's next Prime Minister if the Conservatives manage to defeat the incumbent Liberals. And Canadians, as you mentioned, are going to the polls October 21st.
Now, you'll notice in that excerpt that he said that Canada was giving foreign aid and should not be given foreign aid to corrupt regimes and authoritarian regimes. But the fact is, Canada does not give money to the regimes. They give the money to nonprofits that are, serving the people who live under terrible conditions in some of these regimes. So that was pointed out by several of the nonprofits themselves. It came up and said, look, the money doesn't go to the corrupt governments. It goes to the people in need who are suffering under those corrupt governments. So certainly there was a lot of pushback, and, it's an interesting story, I think, in particular for our international audience.
Well, the leaders have been making all kinds of promises.
Yes.
And every time one of them, if any party says something, analysts look at it and say, well, it's not quite what you're making it out to be, no matter which party it is. So a lot of these things have to be sort of taken with just a little bit of a step back to see whether it's relative or true, or to what extent it may be true. So
yeah, and interestingly, some of there was some fact-checking done by the public broadcaster, for example, that spending in Italy was for the earthquake, and for Turkey and Brazil it was to help them cope with the huge influx of Syrian refugees who are living within their borders. So, it's good to get a perspective, and certainly it's a very interesting election campaign.
And we have not heard the last of this kind of thing.
No.
All right, coming up, we're going to be voting in the election, and you have a story coming up in just a moment about how to get those young people out voting.
Yep.
I should have kept up with those piano lessons.
Oh, you should have, Mark. He actually plays not bad piano.
Oh,
But we're not going to expose you to it on the show.
No, thank goodness.
No.
Well, as mentioned in the past few shows, Canadians are going to vote in the federal election on October 21st. And as always, there are efforts to get the people out to vote. And Lynn, you were looking at an interesting kind of item on this.
Yeah, it's a creative way to increase voter participation. It's a particular campaign run by a nonprofit called voteparty.ca. Kind of sounds a little more interesting than usual, go and vote. This one involves famous Canadian celebrities, and they will be featured in a place where it's likely to reach young voters in particular. So for details on this, I spoke to Duff Conacher. He's the co-founder of Democracy Education Network and coordinator of this outfit called voteparty.ca.
Well, what we're doing is sending a different message than Elections Canada sends, and that lots of others send, including interest groups across the whole political spectrum. Everyone pretty much urges people to go and vote, and those messages only reach voters. And you don't have to tell them to go and vote; they're going to vote anyway. We're trying to reach non-voters by urging voters to make a vote date with a non-voter and take them to vote with you.
And how are you going about publicizing that?
Well, thankfully, Cineplex Entertainment, which has more than 160 theaters across the country, is showing a voteparty.ca video. It's a montage of various Canadian celebrities, all urging people to make a vote date with a non-voter. And that's going to start running this Friday, October 4th, and will run until Thursday, October 17th. And we reach about 1.5 million viewers of movies across the country that way, and that's the target audience, which is mainly young voters who are the ones that don't vote as much as older voters. And the hope is that you'll have 3 young people watching a movie there, and one of them's a voter, and they turn to the other 2 and say, "Do you vote?" And they say no, and okay, I'll help you. Let's go on a vote date. So that's the idea, is to provoke this conversation of people asking each other whether they vote, and when a voter finds a non-voter, helping them vote.
What's been the history of young voters?
Young voters just don't turn out as much as older voters. And there was a bit of an increase in 2015, and we take credit for a bit of that. We reached 3.5 million people with our initiative, voteparty.ca, and the partner initiative, votepromise.ca, in the 2015 Canadian federal election. And the voter turnout increased 7% overall. And the polls show, and they're imperfect, but they show that it increased for young voters by about 12%. But that's still way below the level of voting by older voters. And really it's just because they don't have experience paying taxes, they don't have kids in school, they don't really realize how many different things that government decides that really determine how you live your life. And once they start to realize that as they get older, they tend to start to vote more.
What's the general rate of voter turnout in Canada?
Well, it went up to last election 68%, which was a jump of 7%, and that was the largest jump in between elections. Between the 2011 election and the 2015 election, it was the largest increase since the country was created in 1867, from election to election. But that's still below what we were at now 25 years ago. The level then was more 75 to 80%. And it's understandable why people don't vote in some cases. They can make a rational argument why not.
Why do you say that it's understandable that they not vote?
Well, there are safe ridings. So someone can say, well, in this riding, this candidate from this particular party has always won, and I always vote for them or against them, but it doesn't matter. This party always wins. So that in those ridings, you tend to see voter turnout drop because both the people voting for the winners and the losers both say it's not really worth going out. Nothing ever changes. But, that could change, and you never know when it could change. For example, in the 2011 federal election, 9 politicians won by less than 500 votes, and another 19 candidates only won by 500 to 1,000 votes. And a lot of those were surprises because swings happen. So it's understandable that people look at past performance and past record of what's happened in the ridings, but it doesn't mean that they should not show up. And then others have given up on politics and say, well, I voted and I've had all these empty promises, politicians baiting me with false promises. And we should have an honesty in politics law to prevent that. But at the same time, if you don't show up and vote, politicians really don't care about your concerns because that's how they get their jobs or lose their jobs. So they care much more about voters than people who don't vote.
Thank you very much for this.
My pleasure.
So that was Duff Conacher of voteparty.ca, and we were talking about this, and it's really very interesting that people think there was a broader turnout in the last election in 2015 because a lot of people were concerned about the party that had been in power, which was a Conservative Party of Stephen Harper. Anyway, everyone really should make their effort. And I know that when my daughter was very young, I used to drag her off when I went to vote. She was like 5 years old. I would drag her off and show her what I was doing and explain to her. They don't get the whole thing 100% at 5 years old, but as you go along, they grow up. And anyway, I'm proud to say that now not only does she vote, she last election posted a page. She created a Facebook page which got 170,000 hits, asking people, young people, her peers, to go out and vote. And in this election, she's actually working for one of the political parties. So I'm proud to say, I have a turned-on kid, and I was telling her about this campaign. It makes so much sense, if you have friends who don't vote, talk to them about it and maybe invite them to come along with you.
It's interesting you say that because I was talking to an older gentleman last night, sort of an acquaintance, and we started to get into a political discussion. And now, Duff Conacher said older people tend to vote, and this gentleman said, "Oh, they're all a bunch of liars. I'm not voting because you vote one, he's a liar. You vote the other, she's a liar," kind of thing. Yeah. So.
Some people get jaded. But one of the things that Conacher said in that interview was that even if because we have a first past the post system, so it's the person who gets the most votes in a particular riding who is elected. However, the politicians do look at the number of votes. So even if you're voting in a riding where the incumbent is still going to win, if there is a large jump in, say, the Green Party or one of the smaller parties, I think they do take notice of that. And you see that support, for example, I would expect, and I don't know, we'll see what the polls say, that the Green Party might make more headway simply because of its very strong climate change policies. So if that should happen, you wonder whether the political parties would really take notice of that and understand that this is a growing movement and take that into consideration, you know.
Well, the idea that he's talking about here, these voting with celebrities, I think, if I recall correctly, there was an effort similar to that started at the beginning of the campaign when they were going to use social media influencers.
Yes.
And
yes.
they had to quickly abandon that because they said that these people had also social media posts promoting a particular party.
Yes.
So it was kind of not fair in a way, or not, I don't know, not illegal, but it just wasn't fair. So they had to pull that. And I guess they'd actually paid some of these people already. So
yes, yeah. Well, you have to be careful, you know, because you don't want to be partisan if you're just trying to get people to get out and vote. So anyway, in this case, we'll see how effective the campaign is. I've put a link in the post, so if you want to go to our website at rcinet.ca, you'll see that you can have a look at several of the different videos. It's quite interesting to see how they do it.
Well, the interesting thing about the first past the post system is that in the 2011 election, when the Conservatives won a majority, and in the 2015 election, when the Liberals won a majority, by almost, if you look at the popular vote, the numbers were almost exactly the same, which was just over 39%, which means that in both of the last elections, when we had a majority government, 60% of the people in Canada voted against that particular government. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And of course, Trudeau, the outgoing prime minister, had promised to change the system when he got elected, and that hasn't happened. So
yeah, well, it's a whole other discussion, you know, whether we should change to proportional representation. The province of Quebec is actually having a discussion about that now for its own particular elections. So it's a whole other topic, which we won't get into right now because we've got other good
Let's
stuff.
get into something non-contentious.
Hockey!
Sports. Well, this is something that our man of mystery knows a lot about, right, Pierre? Hockey.
Yes, he's nodding. Yes,
He's off the stage, but he's nodding. Yeah, absolutely. Well, the NHL began its regular season, and for some, that means they'll get to see the occasional on-ice fight between or among players. In fact, many teams have, or certainly had, players known as enforcers, whose purpose, in addition to playing hockey, was to intimidate players on the other team and engage in fights. The whole idea of fighting pervades organized hockey at all levels, where not only not fighting can be actually seen as a weakness. And it's also kind of dangerous, and various levels of juniors hockey leagues have started to institute rules to reduce fighting. But in his new book, Major Misconduct, The Human Cost of Fighting in Hockey, commentator Jeremy Allingham relates the case of 3 former enforcers and how the constant fighting eventually ruined or nearly ruined their lives. And in this excerpt of my conversation with him, I began by asking him about his reaction to a common hockey joke, which is, "I went to the fights and a hockey game broke out." Here's what he had to say.
I mean, I think that's pretty indicative of the culture we've allowed to establish itself within Canada and within the game of hockey. And I mean, this is a game of beauty, of speed, of skill, of vision, of teamwork. And for some reason, every once in a while, we blow the whistle and stop all that good stuff so the two guys can pulverize each other's faces.
Has fighting been getting worse, and some of these really bad hits that people commit?
I think the interesting part, and I hear this a lot, is that fighting numbers are down in the NHL. So there was only 226 fights in the NHL last year, which, I mean, to say only about 226 is indicative in and of itself. But if you add up the number of fights between the NHL, the American Hockey League, the East Coast Hockey League, and all the major junior leagues in Canada, there were 1,770 fights in the game of hockey last year. And I think what that tells you is that hockey is the most epic purveyor of combat sports on the continent and possibly in the entire world.
Is it more common in North America than in European hockey leagues?
Yeah, I didn't dive into that in the book too much, but what I do know anecdotally from players who I know who played in Europe, that it is far less a part of the culture. Each team might have 3 or 4 fights per year, but as far as one player doing dozens of fights in 1 year or one team fighting, every game or close to, yeah, it's not even close to the same.
Well, what's your own personal experience?
Well, I'm a player who just played, minor hockey, rep hockey, so I don't want to overstate my hockey credentials. I grew up as a big fan of the sport from a young age, and I think throughout my life, I really did internalize the message that we hear from the Don Cherries of the world, from the intermission panels. I watched those Rock'em Sock'em videos growing up, and I came to internalize that message that fighting is integral and that it's important to the game. And I went to a junior hockey game, and I saw 2 guys fighting, and as the crowd rised around me to cheer for these 2 guys, and in that moment I went, what are we doing? Why are we, the adults in this big room, allowing ourselves to stand up and cheer on 2 kids who are pounding each other's faces to a pulp? And so from that time forward, I kind of changed my entire outlook on fighting in hockey.
Yeah, I mean, if you were seeing those 2 kids fighting in the schoolyard, there'd be instant effort to break them up, not to encourage them, right?
Well, most certainly to break them up, and if it got violent enough, we'd be calling the police. That difference, the way we treat those 2, I think is one of the things we need to reckon with as a culture.
Now, in your book, you also talk about the human cost here.
What I wanted to do is there have been many books written about fighters who have lost their lives post-playing career, like, Steve Montador or Derek Bugard, guys like that. But what I wanted to do was focus in on players who are still living, who are struggling, but still living, still getting by. And so, I focused in on 3 guys that I came across through my journalism, through my research and investigation. And one guy's a guy named James McEwen. He was the captain of the Kelowna Rockets in the Western Hockey League. And he fought 200 times. And once he left the game because of injuries through fighting, he started to realize that he has the symptoms of something called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, anxiety, depression. And then it came to a point where he was on the verge of suicide a couple of times. And thankfully, he's been able to survive. And then I have 2 other guys. Stephen Pete played for the Washington Capitals. He started having the same symptoms: rage, loss of impulse control. And one day he accidentally burnt his family home to the ground. And then a 3rd guy, Dale Purinton, who had addiction issues, and he ended up 5 months in a New York State maximum security penitentiary for beating someone to within an inch of their life. So these guys are living tough existences, but I really wanted to shine a light on those kind of tough stories of guys who fought and then went on to their lives after hockey.
Now, Mr. Allingham, what do you think needs to change in hockey?
Well, I mean, I think I hear a lot about, a shift in culture, a shift in a way of thinking. But in reality, what we need is someone who has access and control or influence over the rules of the game. So maybe a commissioner like a Gary Bettman or someone like that to take a courageous step and say, players' safety must come first. I don't want any more players to die like Steve Montador and Rick Rippon and Wade Belak. I don't want any more players like the guys in my book to be on and off homeless, in and out of prison, suffering from addiction. And what they need to do is legislate it out of the game.
And that was an excerpt of my conversation with sports columnist Jeremy Allingham, author of the book Major Misconduct: The Human Cost of Fighting in Hockey. And just recently, one of the things I've shown on the website story of that is the image of junior players, and you can see that they're sort of falling on top of each other. What actually happened, because you can go through the links and see where that came from. That junior player skated down the ice. The goalie came out of his crease, and the junior player skated down the ice and directly rammed him. And you can see, if you scroll down just a bit, Pierre, you can see that the goalie is falling down, his helmet has come off, and he suffered a severe concussion, some broken ribs. And later, there was a bit of a fight on ice because the other team players came out to try to get the guy that hit their goalie. But later on, what happened is that the young man went on social media and was swearing and saying, bad things and saying, yeah, I'm proud of what I did, basically. And since then, he's been suspended for the rest of the season. But this is kind of the thing that you wonder where this attitude comes from, is to deliberately want to hurt the other player. And we had another example, if you scroll up just a bit, is those were 2 university teams. And what happened there was some player made a comment to the other player. They started fighting on the ice. The other players got involved, and then the whole team, both teams got involved fighting. You can see it there. They're just, a big melee.
Complete melee.
And something like, 15 or more players got suspended for several games for that action. But it's not actually stopping fighting. And as Jeremy points out, if you're involved in these fights, and these are, often big guys, like a hit like that, when you get down, bang your head on the ice after somebody smashed into you, that's a serious concussion. And concussions, as we're learning more and more, have very serious effects and can have permanent, dangerous effects later on in life. As Allingham points out in his book, and he says, these people are fighting, they're getting hit in the head all the time, without protection, of course, because these are bare knuckle things, right?
Yeah, and the helmets come off.
As opposed to boxing, which we know is kind of strange in a way too, but they have gloves. These guys are bare knuckle, so it's hard hitting. And eventually, as he points out in his book, these guys who have suffered all these concussions, it has an effect on their life. It has an effect on their emotions and how they react to things. And he's citing cases where people have, just went rage and got themselves into legal trouble. And one guy burned down his house, the other guy's depression and this kind of thing. So really, I remember watching European hockey decades ago, and it just didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And so, you're in this Canadian environment or North American environment where fighting is happening, or happened anyway, all the time in professional hockey, and you're comparing it to back then anyway, when the European hockey didn't have this. And you said, wow, it's like night and day. These guys are skating around.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why when we had that famous Russian-Canadian matchup in the 70s, that we were shocked because the Russians were so good. They didn't waste time fighting. Mm-hmm. And we, if it wasn't for that lucky goal, Henderson.
Yeah, we might have lost that.
We might have lost that. So there you go. That's the situation there. And that's just about it for today. Pierre, if you could do something for us, we want to talk once again about the app on our website. We should just mention that if people want to download the app.
Very important.
We'll wait for that to come up on the screen. And I believe it's on the right-hand side of your screen or something. There it is. Mobile apps. Whoop. We're seeing all kinds of interesting things there. Look,
it is on the right side of the screen. Just go there. And
you download the app, and that gives you access to all kinds of interesting stuff. Lots of interesting news about Canada and Canadian attitudes towards the world, if you want to follow that. And that's about it, except we are now in this country experiencing the throes of approaching winter.
Oh, no. Please, let's not talk about approaching. Let's talk about the beautiful fall and how the spectacular colors have started. And I was north of Montreal. We have a great, wonderful wilderness with many, many lakes and mountains and hiking trails. And it was interesting to see, though, because little parts of it, the leaves had changed, and in some other parts, the wind had come in and already blown them down. So there's a real variation. And of course, in Montreal, we haven't seen much change yet. Now, you live a bit north of Montreal. Have you got change?
They're starting to change there, yeah. And it's because when you're in an urban center, the heat of the city makes a little bit of difference. It only has to be, a very little difference in terms of temperature. We know that from climate change, 1 or 2 degrees average temperature, and the world goes crazy. We're falling apart. But so when you go north, where it's just a little bit cooler at this time of year, the leaves have already started to change, and they can be magnificent. I mean, just, you look at the colors. It's just
the best time of year, and it's cool. The air's fresh, and often you get beautiful sunny days. And the light also is at a bit of a different angle, so the light is golden. It's just spectacular. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed being up there.
Yeah, the good thing, though, is it has to not have a couple of heavy storms to blow all the leaves down before all these colors come out.
Well, that's it. It does. It varies dramatically from year to year. You don't know. One year will be much better than the other. And it also varies from region to region, depending on where. But you can, once retirement comes, the plan is to start north and then to follow the progression southerly, so that as you move south, the temperatures get warmer. So the leaves, you could sort of follow it right down into the United States.
All the way to the Caribbean and the beaches.
And then you can spend the winter there on the beach. Oh, no. You won't convince me because I like winter.
But there's one more thing.
What?
This is the end of summer when the apple season starts.
I've already been apple picking once. You?
Oh, no, but I'm going to go, boy.
Oh yeah, they're hard, they're crunchy, and we have like a million different varieties. And you can go several consecutive weeks because they come ripe at different times. So there are some of us who go frequently, like 3 or 4 times in the season. And my apple is full of fridges. My fridge is full of apples. I can't really fit anything in.
We got to say goodbye. So for Lynn and myself and the people in the control room, take care until next week.
Come
Bye-bye.
eat apples. See our leaves.